Okay.
Thanks.
All right. If people could please take a seat, we will begin. There are a couple of seats up front. You don't have to be embarrassed. There's also some along the back. And there's also an overflow room if you need it. Okay, we'll get started. Good afternoon. I'm Cindy Arnson. I'm director of the Latin American program here at the Wilson Center, and I am delighted to join with the Inter-American Development Bank and my colleagues, my colleagues in the Mexico Institute and the Brazil Institute who are joining me. I see Chris Wilson somewhere around. I think there he is. Thanks. Thank you for joining us in sponsoring this event on Latin America and the Caribbean's participation in global value chains. Overall, I think it's safe to say that there's a fair amount of pessimism about the current state of the economies in Latin America and the Caribbean. Some would qualify this and say it's realism, not pessimism, but whatever. It's different than it was several years ago. Following what some people have dubbed the golden years of growth, drops in poverty, drops in inequality between 2003 and 2012, growth of something like 4.5% on a regional average. Economies have stalled, foreign investment has declined quite precipitously. Commodity prices for basic minerals and energy exports have plummeted, and inflation is rising in a number of countries. And this is without talking about the two countries, Venezuela and Argentina, that are in particular crisis. So there is concern that in the current economic context, it will be very difficult and perhaps even impossible to maintain the historic gains in poverty reduction and the growth of wages and formal employment. This overall context is an important backdrop to today's discussion about global value chains and the place of Latin America and the Caribbean in them. First, a definition for those like me for whom this is not a household word. Value chains refer to a process or a pattern of industrial production in which goods cross borders multiple times before resulting in a final manufactured product. Since high commodity prices are no longer sufficient, if they ever were sufficient, to bolster rapid growth in Latin America and the Caribbean region, it's more critical than ever to focus on industrial production, the way Latin America and the Caribbean fit into patterns of production on a global scale, and how these two phenomena are linked to patterns of or processes of improving competitiveness and innovation. As the new IDB report that we're going to discuss today indicates, Latin America and the Caribbean participate far less than Asia and Europe in global value chains. But rather than simply point out this relatively bad news, the report also suggests ways for taking greater advantage of globalized production chains through improvements in infrastructure and logistics, the lowering of trade barriers, the harmonization of trade agreements, and the enhancement of skills and human capital, among other things. We have, as we open today's seminar, a true embarrassment of riches and expertise to discuss this important theme. We will start with Antoni Esteve de Ordal, who probably has the most difficult last name in Washington to pronounce, who is the manager of the IDB's integration and trade sector. He has expertise on trade policy, on economic integration, regional cooperation policies in Latin America and the Caribbean, Asia, and Europe. He has contributed to any number of bank studies and bank operations, including the actual design of instruments and financial products to support trade and development and integration initiatives. He, before joining the IDB, taught at the University of Barcelona, and Harvard University, and is one of the most widely published and respected economists on these issues, let alone in Washington. He holds a PhD in economics from Harvard University. Following Tony's introduction, we will hear from Juan Blaid, who is the senior economist at the Trade and Integration Sector of the Inter-American Development Bank and the principal author of today's report. He has focused on issues of productivity, trade, transport costs, international value chains. He joined the IDB in the year 2000. Previous to that, he was a congressional advisor in Venezuela and an assistant professor at the Universidad Católica Andrés Bello. He also received his PhD in economics from the University of Colorado at Boulder. Then we have two outstanding commentators. Immediately to my right, Francisco Sanchez, who until November of last year served as Undersecretary of International Trade at the U.S. Department of Commerce, a post to which he was appointed in 2009. He led efforts from that position to improve the global business environment, including promoting the goal of doubling U.S. exports by the end of this year. He also served in the Clinton administration in the Department of Transportation and was at the White House and as a special assistant to President Clinton and chief of staff for the envoy of the Americas. He currently is a partner with CM Partners. He is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and serves as on the board of counselors of McLarty Associates in addition to other positions. And then last but not least, Barbara Kochwar is a research fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, where she focuses on questions of trade, investment, regional integration. She has written comparative analyses of Latin American investment in Latin America, on Mexican economy, on Chinese foreign direct investment, and on commercial relations between the United States, the Middle East, and Africa. She also teaches, while doing all of those other things, she teaches economics at Georgetown University, courses on political economy and on trade and integration. Used to be the chief of the Foreign Trade Information System at the Organization of American States, and holds a PhD from my alma mater, SAIS. So without further ado, I would like to thank, however, several people whose work has been essential to the holding of today's event. From the Latin American program, Veronica Colon Rosario, who's probably around somewhere snapping pictures, and our hardworking interns, Alejandra Argueta and Mary O'Connell, and from the IDB, a long host of people, Rodrigo, Jesus, Carolina, Cristina, Vanessa, and Jerry. We thank you all, and look forward to the presentations. Tony.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, for hosting this joint event with us to launch this report. Also, thanks to Frank and Barbara to agree to come and read the book and discuss this report. I'll just do a very brief introduction of this report and let Juan, who is really the coordinator and the main author of the report, to go through the key findings and the key conclusions of this work. Just to put this a little bit in context and do a little bit of advertising on our side. This is one of the latest report of a series of reports that the banks put together. The Integration and Trade Sector Department almost every year and a half. It's a series of reports that have been systematically looking at one specific question, which is what are really the trade our region has in terms of becoming more competitive, what are really the bottlenecks that the private sector faces trying to be more competitive in global and regional markets. And we have like 5 reports now around the same topic. If you are interested, they are all available. We look at, first we had a book on what we call bridging regional agreements that look at the regulatory cost and the transaction cost imposed to private sector by the way of having all this complex network of agreements. And we see this as a cost for the private sector. And we make some policy recommendations dealing with the need for convergence and harmonization of these type of rules. Then we move a second report that look at what we call information cost, the lack of information about foreign markets. And we had very specific recommendations, something that Franks know very well, on how we can improve and modernize the institutions for export promotion. So it was a very useful book for the bank to work with our clients, especially on export agencies around the region. And then we have two sequence of books dealing with what we think is the key problem in the region, which is infrastructure. One of the reports looks at the international transport costs, international infrastructure, maritime infrastructure, air infrastructure, how you move your goods from the port of exits, from your airports, from the ports to the global markets. And the last one that we did last year looks at something that we sometimes forget, which is the domestic infrastructure, how you actually move goods from the centers of production, sometimes in very isolated areas, to the ports and to the exports, so that these regions that are less advantageous have the access to the global markets. And the last one, which is this one that we are presenting today, Synchronized Factories, look at one specific cause in what Cynthia has described very well, this global fragmentation of production, which is about coordination cost, the coordination cost among different factories that have to produce a final good. So this is kind of the themes that we have been putting together, and if you're interested in any of these flagships, you feel free to download. This particular one, the one that Juan will comment and will be discussed by Frank and Barbara, we think that is very important for at least two specific challenges that the region has in terms of becoming more competitive regionally and globally. One is about diversifying production. We think that this way of fragmenting production offer countries the possibility to be in a part of the chain of the production and use comparative advantages accordingly to this chain. And another one that will be discussed also by Juan is the potential for gains in productivity. We know that firms that engage in global trade are generally the more productive ones, but also we know the reverse things, that engaging in global trade because of the transfer of technology and other things are also, it's a factor for making firms more competitive. So this is a two-way street that we are exploring a little bit in this report. And with this introduction, I'm leaving the floor to Juan for the presentation of the report. Thank you. You will control here.
Okay, thank you. I would like to join Tony in thanking the Wilson Center for the opportunity to come here and make a presentation about this book. So the purpose of the book, we have basically two objectives that we want to accomplish with this book. The first one is related to diagnostics. We wanted to have a comprehensive picture of what was the participation of the countries in Latin America in global value chains, and to compare that participation with the participation of other regions like Asia and the European Union. And the second objective, or the second goal that we want to accomplish was related to policy prescriptions, of course. We wanted to describe what were the main factors behind this difference in participation rates that we observe in global value chains, and to examine if there is policy space that we can implement in order to try to reduce these rates of the difference in participation rates. So what I'm going to do in the rest of the presentation is basically I'm going to show you some of the main findings in each of these two goals that we have. So let's start with the issue of participation. Let's start with the diagnostics. So here what we did in the report was basically to build a battery of different indicators of participation in global value chains. So let me show you some of them. This one perhaps is the simplest one, and it's based on what is called the index of intra-industry trade. And basically, I mean, the idea is very simple. If you're a country that you participate a lot in global value chains, you probably are importing inputs, and then you are adding some value to this, and then exporting it to another country. So in a sense, you are importing and exporting goods of in the same industry. So when you calculate this for Latin America and Asia, this is what you get. You get a big gap between these two regions. We are starting here in 1985. There is a general consensus in the literature that the boom in global value chains really started in the mid-'80s. And if you see 1985, there was already a small gap between Asia and Latin America, but that gap has only grown over time. So clearly an indication, a preliminary indication that Latin America on average tend to participate less than other regions, for example, Asia in this particular graph. Let me show you another one, and this one is based on what is typically known as trade in value added. This is an area where the WTO and the OECD have to work a lot. They basically led the indicators on this area. Our contribution in this report is basically to construct many of these measures to a lot of countries in Latin America that nobody had analyzed before. So in this particular one, I'm showing you is a measure that is called foreign value added in exports. And the idea is pretty much the same. When a country participates in a global value chains, when a firm in that country is producing a good, probably will be using inputs from other countries in order to produce that good. Now, if you happen to export that good, then a good percentage of the value of those exports will come from these other countries where you use the inputs, right? So when you calculate this foreign value added in exports for these three regions, this is what you get. You get that for the typical country in the European Union, that's about 40%. For the typical country in Asia, this is about 35%. And for the typical country in Latin America, this is about 21, 22%. So foreign value added content in exports in Latin America is about half of what you will see in the typical country in the European Union. Again, an indication that, in average, Latin America tends to participate less than other regions in global value chains. Let me show you another measure. This one is with data from multinational companies. We know that multinational companies, a lot of GVCs that we see out there are related to the works of multinationals. So what you're going to observe here is what is called vertical FDI. Vertical FDI is when a multinational company opens a subsidiary in another company, so that subsidiary produces an input that will be used by the headquarters in its own production process. That's different than horizontal FDI. Horizontal FDI is when a multinational opens a subsidiary in another country to produce the same good in order to serve that country, which is not necessarily related to global value chain. So we're going to focus on vertical FDI. And what I'm going to show you is pretty much like a world map of the vertical FDI. And here you really see very important networks of vertical FDI. You see, for example, in Europe, you see a very, very dense network of vertical FDI. You see the United States, in North America, you see the big connection between the United States and Canada, and the United States and Mexico, a lot of connections between United States and Europe, of course. If you focus in Asia, you see, again, a network between Hong Kong, China, Japan, Singapore. But if you see our region, well, I don't have to say much. I mean, with the exception of Mexico and perhaps Brazil, the region really, the participation of the region in these GVCs led by multinationals is really marginal. So in the book, we go with more indicators. This is pretty much what we do in this first part. We present other indicators, and very importantly, we show the results for Latin America, not only for the aggregate of the region, but also for each of the countries in Latin America. So we think that this is important because then each country can see where it stands relative to the other countries of the region, relative to the regional average, relative to the European Union. And we think that this is a very good contribution in terms of diagnostics for each of the countries so they can see themselves where they stand in this issue. Now, and of course, when you do that, you see that Latin America is not a homogeneous region. You know, it has a lot of heterogeneity in terms of participation in global value chains. And we go great length in the book to describe that heterogeneity in terms of participation. But when you see the region as a whole, in average, as I have done here in this presentation, obviously the main thing that comes is that on average, Latin America's participation in these global value chains tends to be low. So the obvious question is why? Okay, what are the factors that are limiting firms in Latin America to participate more in these production networks? And here, what we do is that we move then to the second part of the book, and then this part of the book, then we analyze the determinants of participating in global value chains. So what we do in the book is basically go by different factors. We analyze the role of different factors one by one. So let me show you some examples here. The first factor that we analyze is the role of transportation and logistics infrastructure. So here the general argument is that global buyers that those are the ones who are fragmenting the production. They will favor suppliers that are in locations with good logistics infrastructure, because that will minimize the delays and the disruption in the arrival of the inputs that they're going to use in their own production process, right? Now, we know that the quality of the logistics infrastructure in Latin America tends to be lower than in other regions. What we wanted to know in this book is how much that impacts their participation in global value chains. So what we did is we did a lot of econometric models in order to analyze, for example, what would be the percentage increase in participation in global value chains in Latin America, for example, increase the quality of the logistic infrastructure that they have. So let me show you one of the simulations that we have. This one in particular, we are simulating the percentage increase in the vertical FDI, which is one of the variables that I showed you before, when each of the countries in Latin America improve their quality of port infrastructure and airport infrastructure and telecommunication infrastructure to the average level of the European Union. And you get results like this. Of course, results are different for different countries. In general, the countries that tend to have the largest gaps in terms of the quality of logistic infrastructure tend to have the largest impact. On average, for this particular simulation, the average increase is about 18–19%. Now, what we do in the report is then, after presenting this kind of evidence, is to go deeper in terms of the policy prescriptions. Like we mentioned, for example, in the report, that when you are thinking about the logistics infrastructure area, it is not only about the big public works like ports and airports, but it's also about these soft policies, like, for example, improving the efficiency of a custom office. And we back up those claims also using case studies that you're going to see in boxes throughout the chapters of the book. Let me move quickly to another area that we work. Is the area of regional integration. Now, of course, here we all agree that the multilateral system is the one who will achieve the largest efficiency gains, right? But we also know, the limitations that the multilateral system has been facing in the latest years in order to move forward. So in the meantime, countries are taking advantage of trade agreements in order to boost their participation in global value chains. And the general argument here is that deep integration agreements tend to incorporate disciplines beyond the simple reduction of tariff rates that are important to a number of dimensions of global value chains. Disciplines, for example, like investment rules, disciplines like the accumulation of the rule of origins, or disciplines like the liberalization of trade and services. These are all issues that are important for well-functioning GVCs. Now, that's the argument. We wanted to see in the report if there is this empirical evidence behind this argument. So we again run some econometric models, and where we try to estimate the impact of having trade agreements on, for example, this variable vertical FDI. And this is the result that you get. When you see the first bar, you see that indeed countries that have trade agreements tend to have more vertical FDI among them than countries that do not have trade agreements. Now, interestingly, if you separate these trade agreements by how deep they are, this is done in the next 3 bars, you can see that trade agreements that only reduce tariff rates, like the preferential trade agreements at the first bar, practically had no impact on vertical FDI, but the deeper the agreement, then the larger the impact. That's what this figure is telling you. Now, in the context of Latin America, what we argue in the report is that we have seen some good progress in latest years. For example, you see the countries of the Pacific Alliance. These are 4 countries that seems to be getting serious in terms of pursuing deep integration among them. But also you see initiatives like the one that took place between Mexico and Central America. Basically, these countries have different trade agreements among them, and what they decided to do was just to do accumulation of rule of origins among all of them. And what that means, for example, is that now a firm in Costa Rica can use inputs from Honduras in order to sell the final product to Mexico without having to without paying a tariff in Mexico. That is something that they couldn't do before 2011. So even these initiatives, our argument is that even these initiatives are good, move in the right direction. And what we claim is that perhaps this move should be continuing in the future and perhaps at a more continental scale. Let me move quickly to another area that we work in the report, which is the area of contracting practices. Here, the general argument is that the parameters that governing the relationships between buyers and suppliers in global value chains tend to be established in contractual agreements. So obviously, inadequate contracting practices will undermine this type of relationships. And here, no matter how you look, there is work that Latin America has to do. Here, I'm just showing you a couple of variables: number of procedures for enforcing contracts, and the cost of enforcing contracts as a percentage of the claim. And again, there is in the book we have other variables too, and this is obviously an area that Latin America has a lot of homework to do still. So unfortunately, these are not the only factors that are limiting firms in Latin America to participate in global value chains. There are other factors too. There are not only these three. The thing is that analyzing, there are some factors that are very hard to analyze using econometric analysis and using cross-country regressions, as we have done so far. So what we did in the report also was to bring evidence from case studies. So we developed several case studies for this particular book, and this is just a summary of the case studies that we did. And basically for each case study, what we did was just to find a firm in Latin America that was successfully inserted in a global value chain. And then we asked them what was the problem that they faced before they inserted in the global value chains and how they overcome those problems. And we also had cases of failures because companies that wanted to get inserted in a value chain and they couldn't, because from failures you can also learn a lot. And from studying these companies, we got also other factors that were limiting their participation in global value chains. I don't have time to mention them, all of them. I'm just going to give you some examples of additional factors that are limiting firms in Latin America to access global value chains. One of them is all the area related to information cost, and the second one is related to the lack of capabilities of the firm in order to meet the standards of the GVC. Again, I don't have a lot of time to explain them, but just to say that what we did in the book was just to use these examples and also the international experience in order to present policies that the governments could implement to try to help the companies address these kind of failures, these kind of shortcomings. Okay, that's what you're going to see also in the book. So I think I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to conclude with some general messages that you're going to find in the book. I think it's pretty clear from this presentation that I just did is that there is not a single factor that is limiting participation in global value chains. So in other words, there is not a magic bullet in terms of the policies that the governments have to implement. What we're talking here is a package of policies. Now, of course, some of these policies are not really new. I mean, some of these policies, the governments in the region already know that some of these policies, like transportation or infrastructure, logistic infrastructure, many of them already know that these policies are important for trade in general, and particular for GVC. So what the emergence of GVC is just raising the stakes of addressing some of these challenges. On the other hand, there may be other policies. I mean, GVC is bringing to the forefront some issues that perhaps policymakers didn't have in the radar, especially trade policymakers. Like, for example, this idea that the quality of your contracting institutions in your country might be a source of comparative advantage. So this could be, it might be new for some of them. And finally, another good idea why we should see this as a package of policies is that there might be synergies by addressing some of these market failures and shortcomings in a coordinated way. So there's a good idea to make interventions to coordinate these interventions as much as possible in order to try to take advantage of these potential synergies. So I'll stop here, and we certainly hope that you find the report interesting, and we definitely hope that the countries of the region find this report interesting, and it becomes a contribution that is useful for the discussion of this topic among the countries of the region. Thank you.
Okay. Frank, you're on.
Do I start?
Yep.
Well, is this, I don't have
It's
to.
on.
Oh, it's on.
Mhm.
Hello, everyone. Let me first thank the Wilson Center and Cynthia for letting me participate in what I think is a fascinating subject, and my congratulations to the author and to the IDB, to your entire team. I think you've done an excellent job, and I'm happy to comment on this. You rightly point out that integrated cross-border supply chains really started to take off in the last 30 years, the mid-'80s. And if you need an example of that, just look back to 1964 when one of my favorite cars came online. I didn't know it was going to be my favorite car in '64 because I was only 5 at the time. But it didn't take very long for me to love this car, and it was the Ford Mustang. 1964, Ford Mustang. This classic muscle car was produced by Michigan engineers, by line mechanics, and virtually everything that had to do with the car was made within a 50-mile radius of the main car factory. Now, fast forward 50 years later, and a typical Ford car has parts that come from China, from Japan, from South Korea, from a whole bunch of other countries. And what will become the core of the car goes back and forth between the US and the Canadian border 8 times or more. This example really is not unique. It is really part of a larger economic story. And these days, of large-scale supply chains contained all in one country is really a thing of the past. If you, again, flash forward to 1964, and you look at two-way trade between U.S. and Canada, it totaled about $68 billion in adjusted numbers as of today. The number of two-way trade, the number in two-way trade between Canada and the United States today is $632 billion. And there's a similar story with Mexico. In 1964, two-way trade at an inflated adjusted number of $13 billion. And in 2013, two-way trade between the United States and Mexico was in excess of $500 billion. Globally, U.S. exports of goods and services total $2.3 trillion. It's a number I know well because I tried to double it by the end of this year. We didn't quite get there, but we did. What's that?
We've got time.
We have some time. Boy, you are the optimist, aren't you? Yeah, we're going to knock it out in the last 60 days. This is an increasingly important part of the U.S. economy, and I dare say it's going to be an increasingly part of a lot of countries' economies. I'd say most economies. Now, some argue that these multi-country supply chains are bad for the U.S. economy. A number of groups would say that. Some would argue that it's bad for other countries. And I think it may be hard to argue that in some cases there is short-term job loss. Certainly, we saw that in a number of sectors here in the United States. But these integrated supply chains are here to stay, number one. And number two, they can also be job creators. And so what I would say is that failing to recognize the reality of these integrated supply chains, number one, and number two, recognizing how they can actually have a positive impact on your economy, really denies a nation's citizens the full potential of what I see is more in the future, that is, of integrated supply chains. As I looked through the Synchronized Factories, I noticed that Bombardier, the move to Mexico by Bombardier was one of your case studies, and it should be. Bombardier's integrated supply chain starts in Quebec, Canada. It passes through Wichita, Canada, and it continues on in Querétaro, Mexico. And it's because of that integrated supply chain that Bombardier's plane that's made through that supply chain is competitive around the world. If they tried to make that plane entirely in Quebec, I don't think they'd sell too many of them. If they tried to make it just in Wichita, Kansas, I don't think they would make it. So this has become incredibly important. And as the book has mentioned, there are a lot of reasons why this company decided to set up shop in Querétaro, Mexico. Number one, proximity to the U.S. and Canadian markets, still very important markets for Bombardier. Incentives like an investment in the regional airport there. I think the trade agreement, the NAFTA trade agreement, played a role in pulling this company towards working in Mexico. And also a very important thing was the bilateral aviation safety agreement that allowed this company to stay there by eliminating one of the potential obstacles in their supply chain. This study is really part of a larger story about trade in Mexico and of all of Latin America. Consider that in spite of some of the fears that we have that we may be losing some of the gains that we've seen, Mexico exported $371 billion worth of goods, and Latin America, as a region, exported $1 trillion in goods. Now, smart policies like the ones that I mentioned that attracted Bombardier, I believe have contributed to this. And I think all leaders, both in politics and in business, need to figure out ways to continue to build on these numbers. Consider an article I read recently in the Wall Street Journal that focused on the Copenhagen Consensus. The Copenhagen Consensus looks at different investments that governments can make to try to have a positive impact on the world. And it could be on any number of things. And one of the conclusions that they drew was that trade is one of the top 5 things that a government can promote at very little cost, by the way, to the government, to increase economic development and economic growth. The impact of trade really can be seen all over the world. Some of the clearest examples are in Asia. Vietnam, 18 years ago, maybe 19 years ago, had a poverty rate in excess of 53%. Today, it hovers a little below 10% in just less than 20 years. China, where production of goods for exports helped the most populous nation in the world greatly reduce its poverty. So the results of trade can also be seen closer to home, where the production of automobiles for export is spurring job growth in the United States. Now here's an industry that we thought was gone in 2008, maybe 2009. U.S. export of light vehicles were valued at about $25.4 billion in 2009. In 2012, that number increased to over $51 billion. So trade, in my view, is a huge part. It's not the whole story. It's not the only tool that's needed to grow the economies of countries in the Americas, but it's a very important tool and one that governments, businesses together can help make happen. Now, there are 2 trade deals that are currently under negotiation. One is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and the other is the TPP. The TPP has the most direct impact on the Americas, since it involves a number of countries that are from the Americas. But I would argue that both of them can have great potential to help the entire region. And perhaps the most important way is to learn from what's being done in these two agreements. As you pointed out in your study, if all you do is reduce tariffs, today that's really not enough to get the full gain of trade. You have to go beyond tariffs and look at non-tariff barriers that are slowing trade down. And in particular, regulatory issues and standards issues. Both TPP and TTIP seek to be 21st century agreements that clearly go to reduce tariffs. I don't mean to suggest that isn't important. But it also goes after where there's some real value, and that is in trying to find ways to have regulatory cooperation and standards cooperation. If you can make a product here in the U.S. For the U.S. market that can also be sold in Europe, you don't have to make a second product to go there, you already see an amazing savings. Now, there's already examples of regulatory cooperation between Mexico and the United States, but I really believe we're just scratching the surface. So I commend you in your study for recognizing this and say we as a region need to do a lot more. We're scratching the surface. It's not easy. You know, you wonder, right now when TTIP is concluded, and I'm the eternal optimist, it will be concluded, the president will get TPA, and there will be an agreement in place one day. I'm not going to say when. But when that happens, it creates the largest free trade area in the world, at least for today. And you would say, well, is there really that much to be gained? There absolutely is, but most of it isn't from tariffs, because the tariffs between the United States and Europe are relatively small. So the real gain will be in trying to have regulatory cooperation and in standards cooperation. And I use the word cooperation because I've given up on the idea of having identical regulations or identical standards. One of the things that happens when you have a robust regulatory structure in place like we do, and Europe, is you feel pride of ownership. And you feel like your regulations and your standards are very good, thank you very much. And Europe feels the same way. And I suspect that as we try to do more of that within the Western Hemisphere, there will probably be similar sentiments. So it's not necessarily taking lock, stock, and barrel one set of regulations or standards, but finding ways to cooperate in those areas to bring down tariffs. I want to close with just two more ideas that governments can do. When I was undersecretary, I was approached by my counterpart from Mexico on jointly promoting Mexico and the United States for foreign investment. And a lot of my colleagues thought she had lost her mind. I happen to think she had a pretty good idea. And the reason I thought she had a good idea was because of the growing importance of integrated supply chains, recognizing that we're not going to get the whole thing. And quite honestly, this issue of integrated supply chains in the Americas is not just a concern to Mexico, Central America, and South America, and the Caribbean. This needs to be a concern for the United States. Because if we want to remain competitive going forward vis-a-vis Asia, we need to have more Bombardier supply chains that start in Canada, pass through a U.S. city, and end up in a Latin American city. This is about the competitiveness of the Western Hemisphere, not just countries to the south of the United States. So number one, I want to say I think that's a pretty nifty idea, and we ought to look at ways of doing that. Number two, I applaud the idea of helping countries with export promotion. We do as a country a pretty good job, and I'm not just tooting my own horn in my former job. I'm really talking about states and communities, because in our country, it's not just the U.S. Department of Commerce, but it's Los Angeles, it's Miami, it's Tampa, New York, it's the Twin Cities in Minnesota, it's Michigan. They all have robust economic development programs, and we could do well by encouraging and learning from those examples. So In conclusion, I want to congratulate you. I think you've captured the current state of affairs and what governments can do to move what I believe is an important tool for economic growth, and that is promoting integrated supply chains within the Western Hemisphere. Thank you.
Great, great, thank you. Barbara.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'd also like to thank Cindy for inviting me to be here at the Wilson Center, and to the colleagues at the IDB for inviting me to participate here, and also for allowing me to read this wonderful book. When Tony got in touch with me and asked me whether I would like to read this book and comment on it, my first thought was of my workload, and it's, not a, it's small, but it's not that small, and it's very dense. It's very well researched. The thing with these flagship stories, really, is that this team does such a good job of putting together really complex ideas and really complex data and really sophisticated data analysis and making it all seem sort of normal. They write really good stories around this. It's kind of like you can eat anything with enough guacamole, right? You can understand just about anything that Tony and his team produce. And so I read this with interest for my own research, but also as a professor, and I'm always on the lookout for things that can communicate effectively to students who may not yet be trade policy or integration junkies, with the thought that maybe this, and I think this could actually help a bunch of them. So they'll probably be sending their resumes your way after this. I think this is a really important study. For a couple of reasons. One is that Latin America really has been absent from the global value chains, and Latin America has been absent from the global value chain literature. I was at a conference on trans-Pacific trade relations not too long ago, which grouped together people from the Americas and people from Asia. And my colleagues from Asia repeatedly sort of expressed their amazement that Latin America doesn't seem really concerned with becoming more a part of global value chains. And they expressed their own experiences, and Secretary Sanchez mentioned the cases of Vietnam and China, and this is sort of well known in Asia, that participating in global value chains and regional value chains and bolstering your export robustness is a key to alleviating poverty and to setting the conditions for good growth. And why hasn't Latin America got this? And I think that a number of those factors are expressed here in this study. If this doesn't help Latin America get this, then probably nothing will. This also comes at a really important time when the hemisphere, in terms of trade policy, is so bifurcated. You really, if you rank the countries along any number of indicators, you get this continental divide between countries that are seeking more openness in trade and investment and countries that are not. And I think that this study very subtly points out the dangers of such a bifurcation. I think that by looking at these case studies and looking at the indicators and looking at sort of the underlying factors and then looking at outcomes across different regions, they point out how important it is to bridge this continental divide and give some concrete steps for policymakers to do so. Being the IDB, they can't be too explicit in terms of the politics, but I think that their focus on the outcome is really, really interesting. Why do we care about this? The report elaborates the potential gains of participating in global value chains, the more rapid and its implied less distortive and less expensive industrialization. This is a study that really sets out participating in global value chains as a reasonable alternative to industrial policy for bolstering the industrial base in Latin American countries, for bringing more entrepreneurs into the growth aspect of the economy, and potentially for creating more jobs and more opportunities for Latin Americans. They point to increased trade opportunities and the increased opportunity to diversify exports, which at a time of declining commodity boom opportunities is really important for Latin America, and policymakers are looking for ways to do this. And this report points out a number of maybe not easy steps, but concrete steps that could be taken. And then, of course, the benefits of learning, technology transfer, and knowledge spillovers, which can be a way for Latin American countries to start to engage in global value chains and move up the value-added ladder, which is something that most countries express a desire to do. So in an era of increasing headwinds, these benefits are increasingly important. And there's a suggestion that the region's divisions make these more and more elusive, but that working together could help the region to gain some of these benefits. The report in Chapter 2, which is the chapter on Latin America, points out that Latin America participates more in global value chains than many of us realize. And I have to admit that when I was reading this, I realized I was guilty of this, because when I look at things like the Pacific Alliance, one of whose stated objectives is to bolster regional value chains with the goal of increasing their participation in global value chains, right, by increasing their trade and investment with Asia, I often wonder, where are those value chains? And some of those answers are in this book. They also point out that it's important that you don't need to create regional value chains per se to integrate into the global economy, but that you can participate in segments of those value chains. And I thought that that was an important message, and this could be very helpful for policymakers, particularly in initiatives like the Pacific Alliance, and for those that are not participating in such directed initiatives. In addition to clarifying this, I think the report makes several important contributions. One was that wonderful global value chains graphic. I think this can be added to the pantheon of IDB graphics, along with the spaghetti bowl. I think this goes right up there, and probably many of us will use it in our PowerPoint presentation, citing you, of course. But it really paints a very powerful picture of where Latin America is and where Latin America is not. Also, the focus on the service sector. This is touched upon as an area. And this, I think, for those of us who are thinking about these things and see the participation mostly in the primary sector, see some of the limitations, potential limitations in the industrial sector, the services sector, the tertiary sector seems like a logical place for Latin American countries to participate, particularly when you take into account the aspect of geography. Right? Large parts of Latin America face significant geographic challenges, which, coupled with the transportation infrastructure challenges, make it much more difficult for Latin America to participate in manufacturing chains. It would be great to see more done on the services sector, and I suspect that that's probably on the agenda. Of course, the focus on transport infrastructure is extremely important, and it's a great contribution that this book points out exactly how this serves as an impediment to Latin American firms, both for increasing participation and moving up the value-added ladder. Lastly, the team, Juan, very modestly stated the objective to raise the awareness of this issue for trade negotiators. I would recommend that the IDB go even further than this, and I think that this is a very good tool to raise awareness for trade negotiators. If they have the time to read the whole book, I would recommend that you set out a manual for trade policy for trade negotiators, thinking about how the Pacific Alliance negotiators can insert themselves into these global chains, what the TPP negotiators should be thinking about, and what those countries that are participating in and might be thinking about participating in plurilateral negotiations such as the TISA and the ITA should be thinking about. A couple of other areas for future research. I think the welfare aspects of participating in global value chains, and here I'm thinking more of sort of the macro than the Harbinger triangles per se. When you look at cases of countries that are more integrating according to, say, the Hummel's indicators and some of the other ratios, you find countries like Honduras, which is not always a model for enhanced welfare gains. It'd be really interesting to see how countries like that could translate their integration into greater welfare gains for the population, maybe by using case studies from others, and how they could maintain that level of integration. Lastly, I think that this study also points towards some interesting recommendations for the multilateral level. The multilateral level, of course, as a trade economist, negotiating at the multilateral is always the best option. Perhaps you could set out some issues that countries could be thinking about as they try to retool the multilateral agenda. You've pointed out some of the really important elements that make trade interesting and beneficial to countries. What types of things need to be done, and what types of incentives could you set out that countries working together could negotiate together with other regions in order to achieve greater benefits for all? So I really enjoyed this study. I look forward to your next flagship. And I hope that trade policy people, entrepreneurs across the hemisphere, and I'll certainly send this to my colleagues in Asia so that they know that Latin America is thinking about this. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. Okay. Before opening this up to all of you, I'd like to ask two questions of the panelists. One perhaps to Frank, although this is really for anyone. Geography that Barbara just mentioned is an important aspect. Obviously, Mexico shares a long border with the United States and is close to Canada, relatively speaking. How much does the pattern of integration that Mexico has had with North America, how much is that replicable for other countries of the hemisphere in terms of these global value chains, the desire to increase, the integration into value chains, and at what point does transportation, even if you have good infrastructure, at what point do transportation costs become an important inhibitor of this kind of integration? And then probably more for Tony or for Juan, aside from the stated interest of the Pacific Alliance countries in participating at in a greater level in value chains, what concretely is being done to make that happen? Because if you look at the figures of trade between the various Pacific Alliance countries, it's very, very low. So what steps beyond the statement of this desire and the recognition of the importance of integration are the countries actually taking? So I'll turn it over to Frank. I don't want to sort of single anyone out, but those are some basic questions.
I'm happy to take a shot at the first one. Yep. I don't think there's any question that sharing a border makes it easier for cross-border supply chain integration. I don't think it's an accident that chart that I think, I too like that chart that he had. But if you see all the integration that takes place in Europe, I think part of that is simply because it's much easier to trade with countries that are contiguous to your border or not far away. And certainly I think we see that with the U.S. and Canada, and we see it with Mexico and Canada. Having said that, that doesn't take away from the opportunity to still have cross-border supply chains. I mean, one that I was very famous for giving, I used to just rave about the Brazilian airline company. I used to rave about it. Now I'm drawing a blank on its name.
Embraer?
Embraer. Don't tell anybody there that I couldn't remember Embraer. But I used to rave about it in speeches and said, I love Embraer. And the reason I loved Embraer is because approximately 65% of every Embraer airplane was U.S. content. So what was there not to like? For an Undersecretary of Commerce for Trade. And it was good for the U.S., but it was also good for Brazil. Most of those airplanes were, at that time, all their airplanes were made in Brazil. They now have a factory for one specific kind of airplane in my home state of Florida. But that's a significant, important value chain. I think it's there. I think transportation is critical. There was a long time where if you wanted to get anywhere in Latin America from another Latin American country, you went to Miami. If you were in Lima and you wanted to get to Buenos Aires, better off to come back to Miami and then fly to Buenos Aires. airlines like Copa, Chile are changing that. And I think we need to see more of that kind of integration in the airline business. So I think that clearly there are advantages to contiguous borders for cross-border supply chains, but it's not the only way to have them, and I think there's still plenty of opportunities.
Great. Tony?
Just very briefly, and I think Juan also can add to that. On the first question, I think Frank is completely right, and I think we made the point in the book. We should be talking more about regional value chains than global value change, and this is what we have now. This is the value change that you got in Asia. You have to look at ASEAN. In Europe, you have to look between Western and Eastern Europe, and here in North America is also. So this is more regional than global as far as we have it today. And on the other question, just very briefly, and maybe Juan can add to that also, one just simple example on the Pacific Alliance that changes the way I think that negotiations should be done to take into account this new logic is the participation of the private sector. The involvement of private sector into the negotiations are critical to actually identify where are the bottlenecks, where are the key standards that have to be harmonized, or where should be the cooperation. And I think this is one of the big additions that the Pacific Alliance has done in terms of how to negotiate these things, the involvement and the input of the private sector to this process.
Yeah, just to add something, on both questions. I think in terms of the geography, this is very important. When you do these regulations to try to see what is the sensitivity of participation in global value chain related to distance is always going to come positive and negative and significant. But what is interesting is that the role of the logistic infrastructure will be more important for distant countries than for close countries. And this is, I mean, it's not that the logistic infrastructure for Mexico is not important for the United States, but it's more important for Argentina if you want to access the United States. So, and we have a fascinating case study in the book that you know, this company in Argentina produce auto parts, and you know, almost by magic, I mean, this company supplies, you know, auto parts to you know, automakers like BMW, Ferrari. I mean, its clients are 8,000 kilometers away from where they are in Rafaela. And because it's so long, they have to orchestrate this huge system to make the clients think that there is no distance between them. So for, you know, for Mexican suppliers, they might not need to do all this orchestrated system because, you know, they are so close. When you're so close, you can deliver everything almost fast. But when you're so far away, you know, the disadvantages of distance is huge. And this presents, and geography presents a problem for Latin America because Latin America is a huge continent. When you measure the bilateral distance between all the countries in East Asia, what we call the factory Asia, that's around, on average, around 2,400 kilometers. If you do the same in Latin America, and if you include the United States and Canada, it's around 3,200 kilometers. If you do it in Europe, it's only 1,700 kilometers. So just, and also the fact that we have to ship a lot of things by trucks. In Asia, is pretty much by ocean, and then the economies of scales are, you know, the costs are lower because everything is by ocean. So just to start, we have, you know, a disadvantage in terms of geography. What that means is that the quality of logistic infrastructure is even more important for Latin America than for Asia and than for Europe because of these disadvantages in distance that we start with. Yeah, for the Pacific Alliance, I think that they're just starting, right? I mean, I think that we'll probably have to wait more time to see how what they are doing will consolidate in terms of value chain. But certainly they really are looking into this thing, and they. You know, the accumulation of rule of origins is a good thing. They also are going to try to do a lot of factor movement around them. I think that they have this work permit that you can work on, at least temporarily in the different countries. So these are all issues that will eventually, hopefully, will incentivize these production networks around them.
Great. Barbara, do you want to add anything?
Very briefly, I think you have to take geography seriously, and I think that's a very important question. When you look at countries that are separated by the Andean range of mountains, setting up a production process for automobiles, for example, is costly. But that's when we think of old style regional integration arrangements, that's kind of the examples that I think come up, trying to do that sort of manufacturing, which required very high and very expensive trade barriers. But I think Juan points out that things are a little bit different now. You can manufacture, say, the chip that activates the heating pad in your car seats, for example, and send that to other production locations that then have easier access to the U.S., the European market. But I think what really illustrates this is this other figure that's not quite as sexy as the global lines, right? But it's the graph that looks at the improvements in bringing up your ports, your ICT, and your road transport infrastructure to European standards. Those are not insignificant gains, and that points to there being a lot of because I assume, I didn't read the appendix, I'm sorry, but I assume that you've counted for ruggedness or mountains and this sort of, right, in your equations. And so that shows that in addition to geographical barriers, there are a lot of policy barriers that are still there to be reduced, and that at least will allow for additional economic activity. So I think that's another graph to put in the pantheon.
Wonderful. We have time for some questions. Please wait for the microphone. We have a couple of microphones around. And introduce yourself by name, by institution. I'll start here. Then here, oh my God. I'll take 3 at a time, okay? And then down here, okay? Or maybe we'll take these 2 and then pass it over to you, okay? Go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Emilio Bunge with Development Finance International. We work with clients in global value chains across the globe. Fascinating report. I had a question of whether, I think Barbara alluded a little bit to it, if you look at the knowledge economy, whether the numbers could be statistically significant. I saw the potential improvements for investments in ICT that could be made in the region, and probably a Ford Mustang has $4,000 or $5,000 worth of software today. That should be an area that Latin America, given some of the other disadvantages, should be looking more. The other one I'm interested, when you look at the case studies, you look a lot from the supply side, if I would say, what governments should do. But I'm curious, when you look to Philips or you look to one of these companies, and they're looking to geography, proximity to market. You look at Southeast Asia alone is as big as Latin America. What are maybe some of the factors they're looking from on their own investments, right, decisions, right, for vertical integration? Thank you.
Okay, we'll pass it right here, and then we'll go across.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. To what extent is the internet helping out in this to get people to put their money together and to agree on the terms of things so that things can go forward despite geography?
Okay, and back here, across the table. Yeah, just pass it across. There you go. Thanks.
Yes, Andre Ewart, Customs and Trade Attorney and International Trade Development Consultant. I look forward to reading the book, and I want to build on a couple of comments that were alluded to. Actually, Juan, you mentioned it, and Barbara. And things that are particularly important, I think, for the Caribbean. I saw you looked at the Dominican Republic. I'm not sure how much you went into the English-speaking Caribbean, but a lot of similarities there. And so the first thing is services, right? Most of the Caribbean economies are about 80% services-based. So to what extent did your analysis, and others have raised this, look at the implications for that reality of being able to integrate into the global value chain? The second is economies of scale. You alluded to that. I'd be interested to hear more about what you have to say. And then the third is a really inhibiting factor for the region as well, which is energy costs, particularly if you're looking at manufacturing. Thank you.
Okay, who wants to begin?
Sure. Okay, thanks for the questions. So let me bundle the service questions with the knowledge economy question, because it's, software is also services. So we have a small section in the book about services. We definitely want to have that, because this whole phenomenon of firms fragmenting the production is, it's not only that they're fragmenting the goods, the way the Mustang, the car, the engine, the piston, but also services. At the IDB, for example, 5 years ago, if my computer was, something wrong with my computer, I will call 1111, and then somebody from here in Washington in our same building will connect to my computer and will fix it. Today, if I call the same number, that person is in Mexico. It's not part of the building, it's just offshore. So we basically offshore, that service to, to another company. And the same with other companies, many companies are doing the same with legal, accounting, engineering, design. So definitely this is an area that we wanted to analyze. Interestingly, I'll tell you a couple of things. One is that what we found is that if you want to export, we're looking at this point of view of Latin America, trying to export those services, right? So if you want to export those services, obviously one of the factors that always become very significant in the regression is not only the quality of the human capital that you have, but the pool. You have to have an adequate pool of human capital in order to export these services, especially if you want to do it in a large scale. So that's important. This is one, and this our econometric results support some other analysis like the OECD has done for Costa Rica, saying, well, you have a good quality of human capital, but probably they don't have enough stock of human capital in order to replicate these services. So this is very important. Also related to services is there is this idea that services will allow you to overcome the limitations of geography. But also what we found is that because of the geography, Latin America can have a lot of comparative advantages in exporting some of these software, some of these ICT services, and there is it sounds counterintuitive, because services you don't need a transportation system, but because of the geography, in the sense that you are in the same time zone. And what we found is that a couple of cases where the services, these are softwares that are tailor-made, that are customized software. So one is for planes, and another one is for IT solutions, that you really need a lot of face-to-face interaction and a lot of conference call in the same time. And these are so tailor-made that big companies in India and China, they are not interested, because first, the time zone is not good for this matching of this constant interaction face-to-face. And also because these are niches. They are very small, they're very competitive, they're not, and these big companies, they're not interested in working so hard for these small niches. So in that sense, geography is helping Latin American countries to export some services, which we thought that it was very interesting. Related to companies that fragment production, all our studies were from the other side, right? We are in Latin America. We wanted to interview the suppliers of the companies that are fragmenting their production. So these companies do not necessarily decide what are the issues that they're looking when they fragment their production. These are the suppliers. Nevertheless, a couple of years ago, I went to New York to a conference it was called Global Value Chain Management. And the companies going to that conference, it was a course where the American companies that they are fragmenting their production. So I really wanted to know what they learned, how they learned how to fragment their production. So there were companies, you name it, there were Hewlett-Packard, Lockheed Martin, Black & Decker, IBM, Toyota. So these are representatives of these companies receiving a course of how they're going to, fragment the production. And so I was the only person who was not a firm. I was not representing a firm, so they were looking at me like, you guys, you're like spying on us or something. So, but it was interesting because these companies, they really look at these issues like, of course, distance, transportation costs, etc. But they also look at, one of them told me, well, the reason why we don't fragment our production so much, for example, across more countries in Latin America, is because even though we are a big company, we cannot deal with 26 tax codes. We cannot deal with 26 standard codes. We cannot deal with 26 labor codes. Even for a company like us that was big, we cannot do that. So that's why the idea of regional integration is good in the sense that, you're not going to be able to harmonize or converge to everything like labor codes, but many things you are. So that's going to be good for those companies, because otherwise they're only fragmenting the production in the big countries, Brazil and Mexico. But they could fragment some of the production, some of that goes to Mexico. Part of that could go even further to other countries if they didn't have to deal with so many other issues that are different from Mexico. So that's why the idea of deep integration comes in place. The role of Internet, obviously the role of Internet has done a lot. In terms of what the Internet can do, related to our study, is the idea, one of the issues that I mentioned here very briefly is the information cost. In global value chains, the relationship between the buyers and the suppliers tend to be very specific, in the sense that the buyer needs an input, and he probably needs an input with certain standards and characteristics. So he needs to find a supplier that can make that particular input. From the point of view of the supplier first needs to know what are those standards that the buyer wants. He needs to know if he's capable of changing his own production process to meet those standards. So what I'm saying is that the amount of information that you need in order to match the buyer and the supplier are way more higher than if you're going to buy just a commodity that you just look at the price. So you need much more information. So many companies in Latin America, especially SMEs, will fly under the radar of these big companies because there is no information flowing between the two. But Internet can really facilitate that to achieve, to try to break this bridge. In fact, in the bank, we have, for example, this Connect Americas, for example, is one of these matchmaking process that is done through Internet. So that's one way that Internet can help in this matching. So I think that services in economy scale.
The Caribbean and energy costs and.
Yeah, I think that the services issue is important for the Caribbean. That goes with what I said about selling services, because in fact, one of the countries that I mentioned was not in Caribbean, but it was in Central America, that the country that take advantage the fact that they have in the same time zone so they can sell services to the United States. And the scale economy is related to also what I said, that you need a sufficiently large pool of individuals in order to be able to sell a lot of these services, so your average cost will go down. Otherwise, you can have enough quality, but you might need a pool big enough in order to reach the minimum level cost.
Frank, go ahead, sure, please.
Comment on the internet. There's an effort that was being initiated by Secretary Pritzker just before I left, and I honestly don't know where it is. But the idea was to take all of the reporting requirements for exports or imports. So whether it was reporting requirements to the Department of Commerce, to Customs, go to one portal and fill it all out in one portal, even though it is multiple agencies that you have to report to, whether it's for an import or an export. And it seems to me that that one simple act could have great cost reductions if it were integrated into a regional effort like the Pacific Alliance, or maybe one day a new and enhanced free trade area of the Americas by a different name. We clearly have to rebrand it.
Dream on, dream on. Okay.
I am the eternal optimist.
There you go, there you go. I'm going to take some more questions, and perhaps Tony and Barbara, if you have some comments on this round of questions, you can bring them in. I'm going to start back there. I'm going to go across the table. Let's just take 5, and I think that'll be the end. There, across the table, and then 1, 2, 3, these 2 here, okay?
Test.
It's on.
My name is Amgad Chahal, just from UPS. So I'm a practitioner spying in on the thought leaders. So the single window is what you were talking about,
Yes.
Frank. And it's going to take 2 more years in order to work. But I would just tell you the U.S. is not the problem. When we're talking about Latin America, I like to say UPS pays about $150 million for a plane and about $150,000 to buy a truck. And it's cheaper for us to fill a plane up in Asia and bring it to this hemisphere than it is to take a truck from the United States and take it to Mexico and back and forth because of policy. So everything that you're talking about, I'm just doubling down and endorsing that we see every day that policy is an inhibitor, which really could be an enabler, to really use proximity and use geography and use the advantage of integrated supply chains. We're getting in our own way through not hard infrastructure, but soft policy strategic decisions. And so I applaud you for doing this. I'm not sure what the trigger point's going to be in order to wake people up to really take advantage of regional integration and supply chain and value. So I'm not sure there's a question in there.
Just a comment.
Just a real
Very-
practitioner of how we see it.
You can ask him a question, but we have to,
Did you say the U.S. was not the problem on that?
You want me to coin that?
No, I was just shocked because at least on Mexican trucks for a while, I think we were the problem. But I'm glad that you think we're not.
It's not.
Okay, good.
okay. If you could pass the microphone to the gentleman across from you there, thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is David Roback. I'm currently serving as Latin America Program Officer at the Partnership for Supply Chain Management, and UPS is one of our partners, actually. So my question was concerning Juan's presentation. Over essentially, he touched on logistics and infrastructure, and some of the problems he identified, for example, were the customs offices. What other recommendations would you have to improve infrastructure and logistics in the region?
Let's bring the microphone down this way.
Hi, thank you. My name is Jeff Tyson. I'm a reporting fellow with DevEx here in Washington. You raise a lot of implications for governments in Latin America and the Caribbean at the policy level. I wonder what your report and its findings means for the Inter-American Development Bank. How can the bank itself promote global value chains in its work? Thanks.
Okay, we have 2 down here. Go ahead. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to exclude you. Go ahead.
Claudia Farish, George Mason University. The innovation horizon is constantly evolving. You said that this global value chain dynamic became prevalent in like 30 years ago. So Latin America is getting on board now. So my expectation is that a lot of the value that was embedded in taking advantage of that opportunity has already been captured, and that you are coming in at the last minute. So my question is, how are you looking at the future in terms of improving your innovation process, such that things like the internet and 3D printing and that sort of thing that's really going to change the structure of this global value change process, you are more on the cutting edge than dragging up the rear?
Okay, you want to just pass it across? There were 2 people right here.
Diana Escobar. I am actually just moved up here from Miami, Florida. Currently an independent consultant, but I was a prime contractor for the Department of Defense for 8 years. So I guess my question involves, how can we ensure more transparency in the policies and infrastructure? Because as Juan pointed out, there are plenty of ships, there are plenty of airports. In Colombia, for example, which is where I worked with the Department of Defense myself, the infrastructure is there, but the transparency with the policies, lacking 100%. Unfortunately, one day you'll pay a tax that's 30%, and the next day you'll pay 100%. It all depends on what the person at the moment feels like doing. So how can we ensure transparency in the Latin American region if we can't even get the Department of Defense to go through a proper audit process?
Okay.
You're looking at me.
Really? It's all on you, man. It's all on you.
I don't work for the government
Right,
anymore.
right. We have one more. We have one more.
For you now.
Go ahead.
My name is Jose Miguel Pulido. I work for Mitsui & Co. I was very intrigued by the graph comparing or how much Latin America would gain if it would lift up its infrastructure to European level. Did you compare it to other regions, like Asia, per se, East Asia? And then secondly, the vertical value chain, what part of that do Japanese companies play or Asian companies play in Latin America? Have you broken that down by region of origin? Thank you.
Okay. Frank, you were a little bit in the hot spot on some of those questions. Again, to make it clear, you do not work for the U.S. government right now. Who would like to start, though? Frank, Barbara?
No, I think they are mostly.
It's mostly about the report. There were some about U.S. and other regulations. Tony, why don't you start?
Yeah, just maybe a couple of comments. One, a general comment that I think refers to what Frank was mentioning early on, and I think was one of the first round of questions. It's about these joint policies to, for example, to attract FDI. And in the context of the Pacific Alliance, this is a very good example of trying to brand the region differently. What you want is not to compete, or is basically, I don't know who asked that question, is to show that the region will implement policies in which companies can then operate seamlessly in that particular region. And for that, you need to brand the region regionally, and you have to promote joint policies for that. So this is a very critical point that changes completely the logic of kind of designing this type of regional initiatives in our region. And maybe I'll comment on the question by Debex, which is, I think is very pertinent. This will, it will take maybe a whole afternoon to explain how we approach this, but maybe just a kind of couple of points. One is what the bank can do, and I think what's the value added in terms of our approach to this type of issues, or more generally other kind of regional disintegration issues, is the regional approach, is to bring a regional approach to our interventions. We as a development bank, as the World Bank and others, we tend to focus more on the country basis. We usually do country programs, and we cannot support this type of logic unless we take a regional approach. And I can give you several examples on that. Maybe one that refers to the question on the single window, which we have some people here who is actually working on these particular projects. The way that, for example, we approach some of our national projects in the context of the Pacific Alliance is that we will support, a modernization of the single window in Peru, and we will support the modernization of single window in Chile and in Colombia. But then this is not enough unless we create some sort of support at the regional level to create this, what we call the interoperability of the single window, so that they speak the same language. Nothing is going to happen. And this is where the value added of the bank to bring this regional connectivity to national projects is very critical. And maybe the last comment, very interesting on the UPS. This is not in this study. This is a previous study that we did, which we actually we compute the returns of investing on what we call soft policy issues compared to the investments on infrastructural hard issues. And as you said, it's maybe counterintuitive, but the returns are almost the same. We did a simulation there, and what will be the impact on exports, blah, blah, blah. And we find that 60% of the impact will come from infrastructure and 40% of the impact will come from policy regulatory issues. The impact is so much high when you look at the policy compared to the harder stuff. So it's critical to focus on that part.
Yeah, just to add to that particular issue, yeah, it's definitely not only the hard part, the hard infrastructure. I mean, we're talking, I mean, in the other reports that we have also, we have more precise measurements of how lower is the quality of certain hard infrastructure in Latin America relative to Asia or the European Union in terms of ports, airport, telecommunication infrastructure. So definitely that's a given. We have to work on that. But the soft policy is tremendously important. Obviously, each country is different in the sense that, the gaps are different, if you're comparing one country in South America with another country in Central America, etc. So each country then will have to go and, and see what are the biggest gaps. So we don't point those particular differences in the report because that's all already the work of each country to work on the issues. But there are also regional issues that in terms of logistics. For example, one that we mentioned in the report is in Latin America, we have a lot of, in terms of air travel, air cargo travel, we have a lot of bilateral agreements in the region, and some of them has very stringent limitations of the way planes can move around countries. Like, for example, there is this fifth freedom that you have in air agreements that normally you have in open sky agreements like with the United States. The first freedom basically allows a plane to take some cargo, leave one country, go to another country, and pick another cargo there in another country, and go to a third country and drop everything there. So in most of bilateral agreements that we have in Latin America, there's a limitation on doing that. So apparently, according to the UBC experts on logistics, probably the person from UPS can complement on that. That's critical, for example, to have a global value chain that is really regional. So there are some regional issues that in the soft policies that also can be addressed. It's not only country-specific everything. Completely true. There is some path dependence in terms of the GVCs when they developed. They developed 30 years ago. A lot of them went to Asia, and some people say that we might just miss that bus. But on the other hand, from what I have heard from many companies and read a lot of reports, in some sense that's true, but we also have to know that this is a very dynamic situation. Companies are constantly assessing what are going to be the sourcing needs in the future. I was in this conference in Colombia a couple of years ago, and there was this representative of Huawei. Huawei is a Chinese company that produces a lot of telecommunication systems, and actually now they're doing cellular phones that are trying to compete against iPhone and so this person was saying, we have in China a team of 10 people really doing, the only thing that they do is just to see where they're going to reevaluate the sourcing strategies in the world, basically, because salaries change, the exchange rate appreciates or depreciates in countries, and not only what happens in your country, but also in other countries. So this is very volatile. These companies are reassessing their sourcing points all the time. So in fact, one of the things that is happening is that many companies that went to China some are doing reshoring, but some others are doing a change in the strategy, the way they fragment their production. They used to just go to China, and then from there they serve the world. And now it's more like they leave the plants in China in order to serve Asian countries, but then they put another plants in Eastern Europe in order to serve Europe, the European countries, and they put another plant, say, in Mexico, Central America, to serve the Latin American countries. So they're changing all the time. So this is a very dynamic game. What is true, there might be a little bit of path dependence. We might have lost some chance already, but I don't think there is nothing else to do. I think that we can still, there are some opportunities there that we can take advantage.
Yeah, we'll get to you.
Technology as a source of products and the delivery system.
Mm-hmm.
So that you are on the innovation edge,
Yeah.
rather than how you're participating in the distribution of existing.
Yeah, definitely. Diana, well, I think that what your question is very country specific, and I think that that's what I just mentioned, right? I mean, each country in terms of especially the logistics issues, some issues are very specific, for some countries and not for others. So I think that in that sense, just countries have to go and get deeper into that, into those issues. And for Jose Miguel, yeah, Japan is I don't have the exact numbers how much of this vertical FDI is from Japan, but it's large. It's larger than many other countries in the world. And if we do the simulation for East Asia, yeah, the increases in the bars are lower. I don't have the exact numbers here, but are lower than in Latin America. And basically, the main reason is because the gap in the quality of logistic infrastructure between them and the European Union are, on average, smaller than the gaps between Latin America and the European Union. That's why when they improve, the advantage and the increase in vertical FDI is not going to be as large as in Latin America.
Barbara, you want to take a crack at something?
Just really quickly, I think the question on anticipating the future is really important, and what will be the future value chains. When you mention technologies like 3D printing, there you also get into issues such as education, where Latin America, many countries are undergoing education reform, but there's still a mismatch between current labor market demand and skills coming out of the tertiary education, which needs to be addressed. I think it would be difficult to put that into a model, but you could have some sort of a skill component that's specific to trade. But also, I think that still the figure, I guess 3.5, or with the increase in standards up to the European level, shows a real necessity to upgrade ICT, and that's essential for the type of things that you're looking at. As countries do that, one hopes that they would move further along into thinking about more technologically intensive industries, and as they participate more in global value chains, have more of a demonstration effect that will allow them to see more what would be the next technology. And sort of continuing with that figure, just back to the first round of questions on the Caribbean, one of the reasons that the Caribbean, the English-speaking Caribbean countries don't tend to, and I don't know whether this is the case here, but don't tend to show up here is, as I'm sure you know, insufficient data or difficulty of getting data from each of the individual countries. But many studies have shown that Caribbean countries' comparative advantage potential is undermined by a lot of these same issues. And if you look at island transportation, for example, right? This is a big cost. And so one suspects that even though the pool of people is very small, eliminating those barriers could perhaps lead to greater value added in services sector, so medical tourism rather than exporting nurses, this sort of thing. I think that a study on this would be very valuable, and this is a region that could really benefit from that type of a study. So perhaps bolstering regional data or country level data on these things would be wonderful. But I think that's a very good point, because this is a region that right now is facing tremendous challenges in integrating into the world economy and also just managing regional economies. Exactly.
Frank, did you have something you wanted to add?
Very quickly, just to underscore what Juan was talking about in terms of there still being opportunities for value chain integration coming from all parts of the world. In China, for example, I'm working with two companies that are not multinationals. They're not even the large wallways. These are medium-sized companies. One is an LED lighting company. The other one has electric car battery technology. And they've made a strategic decision to service the Western Hemisphere from the Western Hemisphere. They're going to set up factories here to service this area. So I do think there are going to be opportunities in the small and medium-sized companies, the larger or the wallways of the world, as well as the traditional multinationals.
Great. Well, once again, on that bright, optimistic note, perhaps we'll conclude, but thank you again to Juan and to Tony for an outstanding report. certainly thanks to Frank and to Barbara for commenting on the report, but also bringing us the value of their own experience in these themes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Excelente.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you. This was great. Great, great, great.
No, no, gracias.